Oftentimes in Dynasty, you'll be sitting there wondering, should I go with this player or that player? Chris Olave or Drake London? Or moving further back, we go George Pickens or T. Higgins. We get in these situations where people are so player based with their takes, and oftentimes that's a mistake because theoretically, what you're looking at is individual players you're zooming in, and what you want to build with roster construction is not that. You want to build the best roster overall with making plus bets after plus bets after plus bets. So what I'm here to break down with you is why the overall player evaluation in a given season can matter, but in the long-term dynasty, it's not the bread and butter we want to focus on. So tonight on the first episode of Fantasy Lowdown, I want to focus on how these bets that we're making, if we could zoom out a little bit and not so focus on the individual players, how we can get better at dynasty. So stay tuned as we talk about that next on the Fantasy Lowdown. Welcome in, folks. We are finally back. It's been a long, winding road, but we are finally back. Last year, we were the league winners. This year, we're on our own individual platform, the FFU, baby, the Fantasy Football Universe. Go check out all of our content on the fantasyfootballuniverse.com. You can follow us down below as it scrolls across your screen right there. The FF Universe, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Obviously, if you're on YouTube, you're seeing this right now. But I want to thank you all for joining us on the first episode of Fantasy Lowdown this year. What I personally wanted to focus on, because the question I get asked the most in Dynasty is these individual player questions. And a lot of times people are just focused on this wrong. And I want to kind of shift our perspective. When we're going about roster construction, instead of being like, who should I pick? Puka Nacua or Garrett Wilson? And I'm like, does it really matter? That's the question I want you to ask yourself. Like, do you think it matters? Sure. Like, how big of a difference in points per game are you expecting between them? And this is kind of where projections come in handy. And you kind of see a difference in the two players. So maybe you have a take there, maybe you don't. Theoretically, I'm like, cool, if you give me a plus on either one of them, I'm fine. And that's more what I'm focusing on with the Dynasty discussion is. We're talking about tiers, values, and how we go about winning with that, right? Because you could talk about player tiers, and you could do this, and this is how you make these plus EV bets. Like, you can go all the way back to Adam Harstead, who was the first one in the space. So I noticed this back in like 2017 before I really got into Dynasty myself, where he was the one talking about roster construction in a different way, where it kind of like picked a little scratch on my brain where I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's something else I want to talk about. So that was my first initial dive into that, where I was thinking about it and I was like, oh, he's looking at, and this was when I was in redraft, looking at it completely different, right? Where he's like, how do you optimize your rosters in redraft, right? Because that's a hard thing to do. And then over the years, we got familiar with players such as names such as, JJ Zacharyson, where he was really big on talking about how to, strategize your bets and make them with a late round quarterback, right? And then that kind of shifted over where we see the wide receiver market get a lot better where more players come in. And then the wide receiver market kind of takes over. And this shifts over in a dynasty where, if you remember back in 2020, everyone is all about the running backs, right? Where everyone was saying, you got to get the Jonathan Taylors, the CEHs, all of these guys. And theoretically, as we've seen with J.K. Dobbins, like it did not work out. Antonio Gibson, a lot of these vaunted 2020 running back class, we were expecting to be the 2017 running back class. But what we did get from the 2020 running back or wide receiver class was that we got wide receivers that shifted the market. And this even happened with 2019 with like Metcalf, AJ Brown. We get these guys, and they started to build and build and build. Where we're looking at the market 4 or 5 years later, and it's just chock full of really good wide receivers. And I wanted kind of to dive into wide receivers in particular because this is the thing everybody loves. It's a lot easier to trade wide receivers. They're much more liquid than other positions. In certain leagues where you have tight end premiums, things like that, obviously tight ends get a boost. Everyone loves quarterbacks in Superflex. If you're in 1 QB, obviously, tough break. It's a tough one in Dynasty when you're in 1 QB. I have one of my leagues where we're shifting from 1 QB to Superflex. We're pushing out to 125. It's the only way to really do it, but that's a whole different discussion. I don't want to get off a tangent on that. So when we're focusing on this roster construction, right? What's the optimal way to build with these rosters? Like, how do you go about finding what is the optimal amount of players I need at each position, right? Because you'll see, and if we focus on best ball a little bit, you see teams drafting a total wide receivers because you don't get the high end. That's not what you're chasing. You're just chasing guys who could produce points in any given week. So it's a little bit different. In managed dynasty leagues, managed redraft league, it's a lot different. You don't want to weigh down your roster with 15 wide receivers where you have these guys like Corey Davis, these guys like Laviska Shenault, all these players who theoretically like don't matter. And in a lot of leagues, even Curtis Samuels of the world, they truly don't matter in wide receiver markets because A, they're not going to give you different spanking production. B, you can't trade them for anything too. So they just sit on your roster and they become this roster clogger. And we saw this with Tyler Boyd in particular. Tyler Boyd's the biggest example of this, where he still carries name cachet. People know who Tyler Boyd is, but are you ever going to do anything with him except sit him on the roster? You're back in your roster. Do nothing. So this is what I wanted to talk about. Sorry, my dog is going a little bit ham in the back. I think I have some family coming home, so sorry about that. But when we focus on these wide receivers, what I wanted to talk about, and give me 1 second. What I wanted to focus on was with these wide receivers is giving you the ideal way of rostering your starter. So let's go to our standard 12 team. We're just there, folks. We lost a little internet there. But like we're in 12, 11. It gives you 100, 130. So we have that, right? So those you decide to go to wide receiver. Best way to look is starting 3 wide receivers. Do that across, right? So that's let's start 3. We're going to go 2. So that's 5, right? So if we do the math on that with me, right? You do 5 times 12, you get the amount of wide receivers that everybody's starting. So that kind of gives you an idea. On a wide receiver, impact every week. This is what we call threshold wide receivers. That's 60 wide receivers in the league. How do we determine these right? So sorry about that. This is what we call guys that make an impact, right? So if you want to go to Dynasty, we'll look at the Dynasty list. They're actually talk. What is it? We have. I went to Dynasty Data Lab, which is one of my favorite websites. You can go to Dynasty Data as the destination. Debbie got a great job. But I'm just going to so you kind of have to play a little competition. So there's 60 Davis. They're not going to make the cut. As fun as it is with some of these guys, Samuel, Mike Williams, Luke McCaffrey, a lot of these receivers are just not going to do anything. Because this is how All right, sorry about that. I had to switch the internet. We've been having issues all day with this. So I do apologize for that, but let's get back on what we're talking about. So with the 60 wide receivers we're talking about, right? That's the threshold of wide receivers. You know they're going to be making an impact in your lineup every week. Now, when you get to these guys that are below it, like we go down a little bit further on the list, we get into the fun stuff. We get into the Rondale Moore, Jonathan Mingo, the Malik Washington. These guys don't matter. Tyler Boyd, they don't matter. So if you can flip these guys for anything or add them into deals, this is what you want to do because they're never going to make it into your lineup. These are what we call roster cloggers, right? So once you have an idea of what the threshold wide receiver is, now if you want to get a little leeway on each side of it, say you like a guy and you're really bullish on them and he's 62 or he's 68, like I'm fine with that. But you don't have to hard cut it off, but that's like kind of your guideline for cutting it off because there's going to be guys that ebb and flow each week. Some guys' roles change. Maybe Luke McCaffrey takes a step forward. He takes over that wide receiver 2 position over Jahan Dotson, who, by the way, if you can get out of Jahan Dotson, I would highly recommend that. You make that bet and you move on, right? So, like, it's going to ebb and flow, but the more, like, EV bets you can make into these better premium players when you go up the board, not talking like we start moving up and we get into the wide receiver 30s. Well, we get comfortable guys we're starting. We get Cooper Kupps, we get Terry McLaurin. These guys are all starting level caliber wide receivers. Now, they're not difference making, and this is when we get into like the 10-team start 10 leagues and stuff like that. You really want to consolidate those bets with these wide receivers, right? Because that's even less of an advantage. We get down to like the Bricky Pearsalls, the Chris Godwins. These guys might not even be starting for you in the format. So obviously, format is very important. But under the format of the start 11, 12-team rosters, that gives you an idea of what you're looking for. Now you can transition this to other positions as well, too, because with the wide receiver room, how deep the wide receiver room is, it creates this bubble effect in the market. And this is what I'm talking about. When we look at compare wide receivers and we add in running backs and other positions, let's look at like the top 100 players in Dynasty. Do you see how many are wide receivers? So you just do the math in your head. You go to the calculator if you can't do it, right? You do 100 divided by 12. You get your right. So basically it's the top 8 rounds. So we have 38 wide receivers who are top 100 picks or more. That's by far the most of any other position. We have 21 running backs. We have 11 tight ends. We have freaking 25 quarterbacks. So it shows you how the wide receiver market is really at this point, like it's reaching a point I like to call it, we're hitting the bubble of it. So this is what you want to look at with these positions, because when you highlight them, this is what's great about Dynasty Lab, because you can mix around with it. You get every position you want. You can take them off. But what you're looking at with these positions is, how do I feel about the market? How do I feel it's going to change? Because we're getting so much talent at the position. If you look at guys you want to send a first-round pick for wide receivers, are you even comfortable in your standard, like say it's the start 11, 12 team, right, 120 plus? Are you even comfortable sending a first-round pick for a Keon Coleman, a Devontae Adams, a Stephon Diggs, even T. Higgins? Like, where is that cutoff point for you? That's the other aspect of this too, when you take in the value aspect, because there's only a finite number of picks. There's only 12 first-round picks each year. So if you have your first-round pick, are you really going to send it for any one of these guys? Because in particular leagues, they might not be difference-making. So why would you make that bet? Like, why would you send a first-round pick for Ricky Pearsall, Cooper Kupp, Chris Godwin, any one of those guys in the league, when you could find a much cheaper player who's going to give you similar production? So, for instance, if we're looking at Calvin Ridley, what's the difference between him and, say, Keenan Allen? Or what's Calvin Ridley difference between Josh Downs? This is where you get into the tiers and how we deal with roster construction, right? Because say someone is like, all right, I have DeAndre Hopkins. I want to get Chris Godwin. Give me an early second to get up to Chris Godwin. Is that really worth it for you? Because with DeAndre Hopkins, he's an old wide receiver. He carries almost no like intrinsic value. It's all points related. So if you're a team that doesn't need just points, you need some value, what are you going to do with DeAndre Hopkins? Sometimes that bet actually makes sense for you to get off of DeAndre Hopkins, right? But you want to move up higher than Chris Godwin, because what's the value that Chris Godwin can buy? Can he ever crack the top 20 wide receivers in Dynasty? No, I don't think it's ever going to happen at this point. He's already old enough where people are like, you know what? He would need to give me a Cooper Kupp S season for him to get up there. And I think Chris Godwin's a good bet to make this year, but I don't really want to play premium capital to get him. Like, I don't want to spend a first round pick on Chris Godwin. That just seems like a negative bet to make. So this is what we know with this wide receiver position. And obviously, like tiers and rankings, they play it, like it plays a matter, right? Because when you look at Dynasty rankings right now, like who's the player that jumps out to you to me? To me, the guy that jumps out the most overrated right now is Sam Laporta. And I know he was basically the tight end one last year as a rookie. But how does his value go up from here? Like, this is peak value. Is he ever going to be a first-round startup pick? And this isn't even tight end premium. This is just standard, like, just start one tight end leagues. Like, why are people paying that price for him? Doesn't make sense. If you have Laporta, why wouldn't you tier down and get a plus on Trey McBride? Like, you go, give me a 1 on top of McBride. I'll give you a 2 on top of Laporta. Give me McBride. Or you do that with Kincaid, or you do that with Bowers, or you do that with Andrews or Pitts. Kelsey's obviously a little bit more dependent because he's older and he could crumble at any point. But, and if you want to tank, you could go after the TJ Hawkinson, right? Because he'll probably come back not this year, but next year. So if you want to tank, you get the pick player, you could go do that route. I just think you see certain players and the values don't make sense. And this really gets to some of these wide receivers. Like, for instance, I'll see a lot of people ranking A.J. Brown over Puka Nacua. And this is the more micro aspect of the market when you look at it and you're like, why are you ranking A.J. Brown over Puka Nacua when Puka Nacua averaged more points per game than A.J. Brown in his first year? He's multiple years younger. Like, you're getting younger and you're getting similar production. Why wouldn't you make that bet, right? I just think people love A.J. Brown. He's one of those players that holds value just because of how he plays, and people love how he plays. There's a certain aspect to those players where it's okay to roster those guys, right? Because that's a cornerstone. And when you're looking at these cornerstone players, and I'll get out of this a little bit. When you're looking at these cornerstone players, wondering like, all right, do I value this player as a cornerstone player? If you don't, use the market to your advantage, particularly the A.J. Brown. This also applies to Christian McCaffrey, running backs, right? He's 28 years old. My man is not young at the running back position. Now, the flip side of him is he's the one guy that can give you 400 plus points, or like 25 points per game at the running back position. I know we like Breece Hall. I know we like Bijan Robinson. Still, they need to hit peak and get positive TD regression significantly in their favor to even come close to Stephen Christian McCaffrey. Like, we saw what Kyron Williams did last year. He was basically number one in opportunity share, and he was barely getting 20 points per game. Like, I don't say that as a bad thing, but like McCaffrey was pushing 24, 25 points per game, right? And that's a significant advantage that he has over everyone because he's a talented player in an excellent situation. Like, he's done it year over year over year where his weighted opportunities might not be number one in the NFL, but he always exceeds those expectations. So if you're projecting him to get 20 opportunities per game and be around 20 points per game, he's usually going to beat it. He's going to be around 23, 24 points per game. So with McCaffrey, I think it's a little bit different, right? Where you see him and you're like, you know what? I don't mind paying up for him, even though he is older. Because guess what? I know we love to talk about this youth and dynasty and all that fun stuff. The difference is McCaffrey as opposed to an A.J. Brown, who A.J. Brown's never given you difference-making production, like true and like break fantasy production. He's never done that. McCaffrey has done that 3 times. 3 different seasons he's done that. Now, you could say you're paying for past production, and that's entirely true. But he's also a little bit cheaper. You see McCaffrey's price, he's right there in the middle of the second round. It's like, I can understand it. I don't want to pay it, but I can understand it. Theoretically, I would rather just draft one of those quarterbacks in the McCaffrey range where it's a Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, and Superflex. And then if I needed to, right, I could trade for McCaffrey later because you're drafting him here. You're never going to get that trade return for McCaffrey. That's just never going to happen. And if you want to ride him out, so you ride into the sunset, well, he becomes a third down back a few years from now where he's like a PPR guy. Like, there's a way where McCaffrey, he's more valuable on your roster than the trade that you could possibly get. So I get it. I understand the move. But with running backs compared to wide receivers, when we look at the position in general, and I'll pull Dynasty out loud up here again in 1 second. When you see the running back position, right, how many guys do you think give you difference-making production? And I think running back is actually flipped from wide receiver. There's only a handful of guys, and this bleeds over to redraft, right, where you'll see these old guys like Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon. These guys get pushed up because we know their role is good, and they're going to give us that 1 year that likely locked in top 12. Now, if it's not, it's a different discussion. And I think Jeremy makes a really good point here with this trade. Now, this is an interesting trade, right? So he traded Cousins, Pitts, and JMO for JSN and 2 firsts today. It's a big tight end premium. Oh, my boy. This is a difficult one. I know this one must have hurt you because you love JMO. By the way, Jeremy's on it. He's one of my co-hosts on the show. Interesting trade. I actually kind of like it. It depends where these first go for you. That's a whole nother discussion. The tight end premium makes this one difficult with Pitts because Pitts has that high-end ceiling where he could break fantasy we talk about like a Travis Kelce did. But the thing about the tight end position that I really like is there's a lot of guys that position more than actually running back. I like those top 6. I love those top 6 dynasty tight ends. Like, and this can include Kelce if you're on the win now track. I love those guys on the roster. This trade obviously depends what those first turn into. So you gave that team Pitts and you gave them Cousins. Now there is risk with Cousins. Like he's valued around a late 1, early 2. I tried to get that in my leagues for Cousins where I have him and Penix on the same roster. Gotten crickets for him. And it's really hard with Cousins because we kind of need to see it. Because it's like, why would you pay a first for him right now? So, value-wise, I think the value's fine. I think you bought low on JSN, who we've been talking about all offseason. I think that was good. So really depends. If you get early first round pick out of this, I think you're going to be loving this deal. If they turn mid to back end, then it's kind of like, it's what we'll see. So I guess my question would be, is it certified contender or is this team like in the middle? Like if they're in the middle, which we can kind of get into with picks, and I think I love stockpiling picks, what you did, because I'm seeming, like he guesses they're mids. Like, that's a fine. I like that deal because unless you're a certified contender, like this deal is going to help you in the long term because it's so difficult to trade Kirk Cousins and it's so difficult to get anything for J Mo Dynasty. The one piece in that deal, and this is why you got the 2 first on top, it's Pitts and big tight end premium, right? So Pitts carries the name caching on that. So if you want to tier off of Pitts, like you better get something similar to this where he got a good bet with JSN, who's a good wide receiver who can gain significant value because he's a really good prospect and he's going into year 2 in a new offense. And this kind of gets micro we talk about with roster construction. But he has value. He has the ability to gain a lot of value. And so do those first, because those first, they're not going to get any cheaper than they were today, right? So they're going to consistently gain value. So how this deal, the other team wins this deal is if Pitts hits big and Pitts and Cousins are tied together. So basically if Cousins does good, Pitts likely does good. And they if they push towards a championship because of that, that's how they win that deal. But it's a risky bet to make because I'm assuming this team needed a tight end because they paid it for that. And they also probably needed a quarterback because they included Cousins, because otherwise I don't see why you're getting the old Cousins. Like he's 36, he's not young, right? So this team is trying to contend, and I would, without seeing the roster, I would say they're like the paper tiger, where they think they're good, but they're more than like a couple injuries away, and it evaporates, and all of a sudden it can go backwards where you trade those first, and you're like, man, like what happened to my roster? This team is bottom 4. It's like, and that can happen sometimes when you make these bets. We're still got like 3 months till the season starts. Like we're not quite there. Like we're a little bit earlier than that. But like we still got a long way to go. So anyone, and maybe the picks are 2025 or 2026. If there's still like rookie drafts happening and the rookie draft is this year, like I like that bet a lot. But even if it's 2025, like you just sit on those picks and they'll gain value. Now we get into February next year, people are gonna come calling for those picks, right? Or if Jeremy's a contender, like his team is still good enough to contend, he could use one of those first to push in and go for a championship himself, right? So this value bet works out well for him. And this is kind of the thing with Dynasty that I think a lot of people struggle with, where they'll make a bet similar to what that guy made, where they traded for Kirk Cousins, they traded for Jameson Williams. I hate to break it to anybody who's a Jameson Williams fan. How does Jameson Williams become anything like for Dynasty? Like how does he gain value where even if he's the number 2 wide receiver on the offense, is he going to be above Laporta? Is he going to be above Gibbs? Like that's 4 people that you're competing with there as well, just straight off the rip. And there's also David Montgomery. Like JMO is the guy that you sell because he's just going to be a guy that's just going to tantalize you with his speed, and he'll catch a 40-yard touchdown pass occasionally. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. JMO's never going to be a threshold wide receiver. Like I will stake my claim on that one. And I think I love JMO coming out. He was my wide receiver 3 in that class, but it has not worked out, and it's likely not going to work out. And they have the target hog with Amon-Ra. They have one of the best young tight ends in the NFL and one of the best young running backs in the NFL. It's so almost impossible. Now, on the flip side, Jared Goff and that offense, they have like 9 games in the dome this year, looking really well. But this is what we talk about, right? So it's about knowing your league, stockpiling, not just like good bets, also the picks. And this is where the picks come in, right? If you can, like we talk about consolidating a lot. If you have a ton of these players, and we talked about, like, I'll pull up the Dynasty that I'll have again here, looking at these wide receivers, right? Let me actually fix this because this is actually bothering me. Sorry about that, folks. Let's go here. There we go. All right. Now, when we're looking at these guys again, right, and you're talking about making these bets, how far down? Like, say if you had Troy Franklin, say you had add him to DeAndre Hopkins. If you can tier those guys up significantly, if that can get you, like a Devontae Adams, Jayden Reed, like you do that bet because that gives you a significant bet. I know people like Troy Franklin, but man, he's such a risky bet. He's 4th round wide receivers just don't hit. If you want to treat him as the next Amon-Ra St. Brown, go for it. You're more than likely wrong. I put out a tweet earlier in the offseason where I was talking about 4th round wide receivers. There's been 2. It's been Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Crowder, the 2 guys that have done pretty much anything out of the 4th round the last decade. It is a trap bet, my friends. Now, The best thing about these guys is even if Troy Franklin does hits, he's not going to be expensive to buy early in the season, right? Because people still question him. So it's like you could always buy this guy back in, but if you're going to value them now at that price, you just get out and you accumulate into a better bet for a guy who gives you difference making production, or you turn it into picks. Like this is what we talk about. And this is what I mean by like tiering down or tiering up. When you're tiering up, if you're tiering up, you need to make the bet that fits your team specifically. And if we're talking about wide receivers, these are the Khalil Shakirs, the Jacoby Myers. It's going to be a lot tougher this year because they have a really good tight end in Brock Bowers who's going to play the slot. Jacoby Myers, Gabriel Davis, Romeo Doubs. As much as I love Tyler Lockett, he's not the guy I really want anymore. Marvin Mims, Luke McCaffrey. Do you see how you can go down and talk yourself? And I like Jalen McMillan. I think he's fine as a third-round bet, but I'm not going to value him more than that because he's still the wide receiver 3 for this year. If he gets lucky and they move on for Chris Godwin, he becomes a wide receiver 2. I think there's upside attached to him because I think he's a good wide receiver. But if I can move him into a second-round pick, immediately I'm doing that. Like this gets Treylon Burks. You go down to Brandon Cooks. You can keep going down and going down. Adam Thielen, he was wide receiver 17 last year. You could talk yourself into all of these guys. Now, this is where the value and production thing comes in. Like you have Greg Dortch. People are hyping up Greg Dortch. Can you move Greg Dortch for anything, right? You do this, and you not only do that with picks, but you consolidate all of those guys in these bets, right? This is how you make your team safer in the long term. You remove the risk. If you're getting it into a better bet or a plus EV bet, that's how you succeed in Dynasty. So a lot of times it takes sending out. You don't be reactive, you be like progressive with these trade offers, right? You send it out to the entire league. And a lot of people will be like, well, I don't like Devontae Adams. I'm like, then find a similar value player that's a similar bet. So you go up to where Devontae Adams is about. Maybe you like Jayden Reed. Maybe you like Rashee Rice. It doesn't really matter. If you're seeing similar production and you go for the younger guy, I think George Pickens is a fun bet to make this year, right? Jordan Addison. People don't like Jordan Addison. I think you can get him for a lot cheaper, right? Like he's valued at wide receiver 25. I think he's more than realistically his trade range is in this Deontay Johnson, like Marquise Brown. People are not really a fan of Jordan Addison because his routes, like his per route metrics and stuff were not great. He was touchdown dependent. But I saw something Peter Howard did where he said that touchdown, it was actually like his usage. It actually made sense. Like he's not going to regress specifically. If he has that same role, which he may or may not, the touchdowns will still be there. Certain guys can produce touchdowns. That's kind of is what it is. But this is what I want people to focus on, where you make smarter bets. Because I'll have people asking me, like, for instance, I'll talk about quarterbacks for a second. Someone was messaging me today. They're talking about these elite quarterbacks. Now, particularly me, I'm not in on CJ Stroud at QB3. I think that's overvalued. He's another guy, and that's why he was part of the graphic. Him and Sam Laporta. I think CJ Stroud is a very similar bet to Joe Burrow. He's a very similar bet to Caleb Williams. He's a very similar bet to Justin Herbert and Jordan Love. So if I could take CJ Stroud and I could tier down to, like, I love Kyler Murray. Like, he's my favorite in this range. But Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, whoever in your league will give you something substantial on top where they can give you a guy that will impact your lineup. Like, if they gave you George Pickens, like, I'd be like, all right, let's do this deal. You know what I'm saying? A player like that. It doesn't have to be a first-round pick. It could be a player that's liquid that you view similar to that bet. Obviously, the picks are better because they hold the floor of a pick is so much higher than a player. Players, we've seen them all the time. Like before Drake London, before this last year, he was trending down to wide receiver 30 in Dynasty. What happens? They sign Kirk Cousins. He finally shoots up. But if they didn't sign Kirk Cousins, Drake London's going to be down in this range with these Mike Evans and these guys. That's how we view in Dynasty. So right now, Rashee Rice, people are really out on Rashee Rice. He could be the best player on the Chiefs offense. Now, theoretically, I think it's Hollywood Brown. Hollywood Brown is also the cheapest of these guys. So right here, Marquise Brown. He's wide receiver 47 in Dynasty. Is he a better bet than Christian Kirk? I think he is. Can you get him for cheaper? I think you can as well. So that's a player I target, right? So you kind of do these bets. Same thing with Deontay Johnson. He's going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Carolina Panthers, and people will tell you, they'll be like, hey, it's a terrible offense. And I'm like, I don't care. Is he going to get absolutely peppered with targets? I like guys getting peppered with targets. He's got minimal competition in that offense. We've already seen him throughout his career in Pittsburgh dealing with some god-awful quarterback play. He was fantastic at earning targets. Targets are very much one of the marks we look for PPR points because that has a high correlation. Like that's what, and same thing with what Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points came out with this year. He was talking about first downs per route run. Like people that have a high first down per route run, like that's really good for fantasy. So that's another thing you could use to check your bags. It's like T. Higgins. My point with this is we need to stop being so player specific with these guys because we're really bad at predicting situations year in and year out. People will talk about Christian Kirk. They'll talk about Terry McLaurin. They'll talk about Cooper Kupp. They'll talk about Stephon Diggs. Now, can you tell me who's going to be the wide receiver 1 out of those guys? I don't think it's going to be Stephon Diggs. But would it shock me? No. I think we need to be more like the availability to accept uncertainty, because a lot of times people are tearing up, but it's the same bet. And this is what I was talking about with CJ Stroud. Why are you paying up for CJ Stroud? Like, I think you should be moving off of CJ Stroud, getting a plus on top of any one of these guys. Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, Anthony Richardson, Caleb Williams. Where's the cutoff for you? That's what you have to decide. Because the further you go down in dynasty rankings, the bigger plus you can get on top. So if you view CJ Stroud and Jaden Daniels similarly, then that's a bet where you could get a significant plus on top of Jaden Daniels, right? Because they're a little iffy on him. Now, obviously, the insulation with CJ Stroud is there. Like, I personally don't want to tier down into Jaden Daniels. I think that's a really risky bet to make, where you're absorbing a ton of risk by making that bet. So the plus on that deal better be substantial. So like, that's kind of the thing. You also have to use the market to your advantage both ways, because in redraft, it's a lot harder to trade. But in Dynasty, it's a lot easier because people are more open to like thinking in these 2-3 year windows. Would it surprise anyone if Lamar Jackson outscores CJ Stroud the next few years? No. Would it shock? Like, personally, I have Kyler Murray above CJ Stroud in my redraft rankings. Would it shock me if Kyler Murray outscores CJ Stroud? No, absolutely not. Like, CJ Stroud was good last year, but he was QB 12. It's QB 11. He was good. He was not the elite guy we thought he was. And then this gets down to Dak Prescott. If you're a win now contender, if you go from CJ Stroud to Dak Prescott, you get a serious plus on top of that, right? You could get a guy that's going to impact your starting lineup, a significant addition. Like, you could probably target a Tyreek Hill and Dak Prescott, and somebody would give you that deal. If you don't think Tyreek Hill is going to retire in the next few years, you have a difference-making player who gives you production. So you get Dak Prescott, who more than likely, I think I do have, we talked about this today on our show, I have Dak Prescott above CJ Stroud. So would I do that deal for CJ Stroud? Yeah, like a contender, absolutely. I get Dak Prescott. I know Dak Prescott's going to be a good quarterback. The thing you have to accept with making a deal like that, though, is you're certified going into the contender. Now, this is scary for a lot of people, because moving off of a Dak or moving off of a Tyreek takes a certain circumstance with that. So obviously you would like it if it's a little bit somebody, maybe like a Drake London, somebody that is a little more insulated because they're younger, Chris Olave. But the thing with Tyreek Hill is he's going to give you the production. We saw last year he's the best wide receiver in fantasy. If he stays healthy, like, it's going to be him or CeeDee Lamb would be the top guys there, right? So you get those guys, and I think CJ Stroud's great. And I've seen people talk about QB1. I know Jeremy, who posted the question earlier, Jeremy loves CJ Stroud. He thinks he's really good. And like, if you want to do that where you upgrade to CJ Stroud, you think it's a better bet, go do that. But like, personally, I'm on the flip side of that. So if someone asks my advice on the situation, that's what I'm going to tell them, because I'm not 100% sold. CJ Stroud becomes that difference making, becomes that Patrick Mahomes, because people are ranking him above Patrick Mahomes. And I'm like, all right, can we pump the brakes a little bit here? Like, Mahomes has actually been truly difference making quarterback. We've seen it. He's hit the ceiling we're chasing every year that I don't necessarily think Lamar even offers that anymore. So like, this is what we have to talk about with these bets we're making, where it's, you're like, all right, I'm going to tier up or I'm going to tier down. It's like, well, if you tier down too far, you better get super insulated. And that's what I like what Jeremy did with the 2 first. It's all about constructing your roster adequately to make the right bets to help you build a dynasty. Because a lot of times you'll see people, and this is why I talked about wide receivers earlier, when these wide receivers who are just like, they don't do anything for you. They sit on your roster. They just clog it. They never go anywhere. Those guys are the worst ones to make, because they don't help you out. And that's my whole issue with this. So if you know how many like wide receivers, if it's like we talked about earlier, if you have 60 wide receivers who are starting each week, that's the threshold of wide receivers that each team has. So you need to roster at least 5 difference-making wide receivers. That's what you want to go for. You can go 6. You can always go 1 over if you want to go 1 over. But if you start getting to the 8 or the 9, like, that's just burning spots on your roster. Now, if you end up where you end up with like a Malik Neighbors in your draft or Marvin Harrison, you start stockpiling the truly elite ones, I'm fine with that, because you can move off of those guys because they're valued extremely high. So if your stockpile full of those guys, you can always trade them. Like, the way they're valued right now, you can move them into like a Breece Hall, a Bijan Rock. Like, you can move those truly elite wide receivers or guys that are viewed that way into other positions you need. And this is the other thing with Dynasty, where people are going to say, oh, draft that guy because I need them. But if it's like a teardrop, I don't always say that. I would say, if you view them similar, then yeah, do that. Like, that's what we want to do. We want to make good bets. We don't want to make bad bets in Dynasty. And this is what I see new people hopping into the space all the time. They consistently make bad bets. And that's the thing we need to change, because it's really hard to change your mindset from redraft to Dynasty, right? And this is the thing that took me a while. I remember one of the first things I did in one of my second Dynasty league, this was back in 2020 when I first was in this space, I traded AJ Brown for a first and Josh Kelly. Now I was convinced, and I was using a trade calculator because it told me the first is equivalent to AJ Brown, and I got Josh Kelly, who I thought could possibly be a starting running back. The thing I didn't realize is I was taking on a ton of risks with that bet because there was no assurance Josh Kelly was starting running back. Like I was assuming he was, and that was the problem with that bet. On top of that, the first I used for Keenan Allen, like I used not that first because I kept that first. I traded like a later first for Keenan Allen. So like it basically was Keenan Allen, Josh Kelly. Obviously, Keenan Allen is giving me better production like over the course of the span. Like he's been a better impact on my roster, but still, the whole aspect of Dynasty is the value game. The value game, I got crushed on that deal because AJ Brown's consistently been viewed as a top 5 wide receiver since then. Now, this is the first year he's kind of creeping outside of it because he's getting a little bit older and people are starting to realize like he's never going to be the wide receiver 1 attached in that situation with Jalen Hurts because he has a ton of competition and he has a rushing quarterback and they just don't pass it enough for AJ Brown to get the targets he needs. If you're telling me AJ Brown's going to give me 180 targets, hell yeah, wide receiver 1 all day. Problem is he's never going to get that, right? So this is the thing where you view players and you kind of see kind of like the dynasty markets kind of erode on them as they start to age out because AJ Brown is getting a little bit older. He's starting to age out of his prime. He's still in his prime. He's got a couple years left, but like it's starting to happen where people already consider him old, even though he's like approaching 27. It's like he's not old, but in dynasty mindset, he's old. So this is the thing you have to think about these guys, right? So if, like I said earlier, like a little bit ago, where I was saying if you can move AJ Brown into Puka Nacua, like I'm happily making that bet because I view them similarly. I think I have them back to back from rookie, and Puka is multiple years younger. And the thing is, people are still uncertain because Puka only did it once. He wasn't a round 1 wide receiver because if Puka Nacua is a round 1 wide receiver, he'd be the wide receiver 1 in Dynasty because he just smashed last year, right? But because he has that uncertainty, similar to an Amon-Ra St. Brown, people are discounting until we saw it with year 2 with Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's where he took the jump. The difference is people are already like baking that into Puka Nacua's cost, so it's a little bit different. But he's still like I would still happily pay the price for Puka Nacua. I picked him up in startups this year. I traded for him. Like he's still a guy you can get. If he had round 1 draft capital time, he would be unattainable. He would be in the CeeDee Lamb, the Jamar Chase, the Jefferson range. Like he's not there. He's clearly valued below those guys, and that's the dynasty market. You kind of got to take that when you're making your bets. So this is what I wanted to hit on in this episode of the Fantasy Lowdown. I kind of wanted to talk about how we're going about roster construction, how we're making our bets, how we're optimizing our rosters. And I went off the handles a little bit, but by the way, that's just kind of what we do on this show. I kind of fly by the seat of my pants a little bit, but it's all about knowing how many starting guys are going to be in at that position, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks, how many bets to make about that. The other aspect of it is the dynasty game. So like our quarterbacks, then it's super market and it's quarterback. Are they going to hold the value like they always do? They do. They're easy guys to just hold on your roster. Now there's certain ones where it was last year with Aiden O'Connell or Clayton Tune or these rookies who were playing for a bit of time. You knew the bet you were making drafting those guys. You were hoping to flip them for a 3rd round pick or include them in to get up into a 2nd round pick as soon as they were starting. And luckily for a lot of teams last year, there were a ton of injuries like Joe Burrow. We had issues with like Anthony Richardson. A lot of quarterbacks went down last year. So that actually worked out for a lot of guys. Like you were able to trade those guys away if you picked them up off waivers, whatever it is. With some of these running backs in these uncertain situations, like we have, I know we kind of hate on the running back class, but I'm just going to kind of wax poetic on it for a little bit. We have the Kamani Vidal. We have the Marshawn Lloyd. We have Jonathan Brooks. We have a lot of these young rookie running backs that people are saying it's a bad class. But if you look at it, theoretically, the rookies, like there's a lot of guys that can make an impact in year 1. And I just think because people have the ACL issues with Jonathan Brooks, they don't think he's truly an elite player. I think he can actually give you the elite difference-making production. I think he's the one running back in this class that can. But like we have Trey Benson, people talk about, they're assuming he's possibly going to take over for James Conner, or he's going to chip in that role this year. So there's a lot of running backs actually this year before we get to the 2025 class, the class everybody's head over heels above. These guys can actually make bets and be starting caliber players on your roster. So there were solid bets to make this year. And I know we were kind of iffy on them, but even like a Ray Davis with Buffalo, like these guys that went later, there's Isaac Guerendos of the world. I know I talked about him out of it all. There's also Tyrone Tracy with the Giants. There's a ton of running backs who these are the bets of guys that you just stockpile because if they're chipping into actually starting caliber role, or if they're actually starting on their teams themselves, you could flip them for a profit. Or if you want to ride out their production on a contender, you do that. So it's all about making these smart bets, because I saw in our rookie rankings, a lot of people were taking they were taking Jalen McMillan, they were taking Luke McCaffrey's of the world. And I'm like, why are we taking these guys in the third round? I get it. Like, I like Jalen McMillan. I think he's a fine bet in the third round. I actually think he's one of the better bets you can make in the third round. But if I'm getting a shot at a Kamani Vidal, or if I'm getting a shot at a Tyrone Tracy, who I think can actually give you some production throughout the season, like, I'm fine taking those guys above them. You just have to know the bet you're making. Is it a riskier bet? Yeah, because like they could be dust and crumble into next year be basically nothing. Where these wide receivers, who they can actually, they can be valuable for longer. But with these wide receivers, what's the odds they're not a roster clogger? That's the whole thing. Because I like those wide receivers late, but if they're not going to ever get above the threshold, and if the threshold is wide receiver 60 in this deeper league, if we get into the start 10 team league, and you're talking about basically 36 wide receivers that are the threshold, yeah, it's a bad bet to make, because how do those guys ever get into that? So this is about also knowing your league settings and optimizing your roster correctly. So looking at that and looking how the running back market is, like we talked about, there was only 21 running backs inside the top 100 picks, right? As opposed to wide receivers, 36. It shows you that it's much easier for a running back to jump into that range of players where it's like those are starting caliber running backs, right? So, and like the bet's not going to cost as much because people are down on running backs in general. We're so wide receiver pilled right now. Like, we just love wide receivers. But you see in Dynasty, like, teams are starting to feature the running backs more. They're kind of shifting away from the wide receivers. Obviously, there's a ton of the elite wide receivers, but once you get outside the truly, like, how many elite wide receivers are there? Like, I love Rome Odunze. I think he's an elite prospect, but is he going to give you elite production in year one? Probably not. What about DK Metcalf or Tank Dell or T. Higgins? There's the high-end wide receivers. And really, once we get past, and like Dynasty, once we get into the Ayuk, the Waddle, the Nico Collins, I think Nico Collins is fantastic. He's the best one of those guys. But even him, I think it's really hard for them to jump into the top 5, particularly because the competition aspect for all of those guys. Like, we've seen Ayuk, he's never gotten over 105 targets in a season. Waddle, same situation. He's buried behind Tyreek Hill. You can do this with Devontae Smith. Michael Pittman has Anthony Richardson. They added A.D. Mitchell. They have Jonathan Taylor. Like, how many targets is he going to get? Is he going to get targets when he got last year? No. So when we look at these wide receivers, I really want to see people either moving up out of that middling, like from wide receiver 12 to like wide receiver 30. There's a bunch of guys, like, you have to find the guys that you think could jump up above that, because it's hard to find those guys. Now, if you think you can find it, make that bet on that guy. But I want to tear up from that. Now, Rome Odunze, I have higher. Like, I'm significantly higher on him. I think he's going to be pushing for the wide receiver 1 job this year in Chicago, because I just think he's better than Keenan Allen, and I think he's a way better prospect than DJ Moore, and I think he can make a bigger impact. But even with the competition, like, I think he will play on 2 wide receiver sets. I think he will do all that. But that's what I believe. If you don't believe that, why are you paying that price for him, right? You should go get Brock Bowers, because Brock Bowers can be a guy straight out of the gate that can give you that production. And we do this same thing with Jonathan Brooks. Like, this is why I was very comfortable taking him in the late first round, where people talk about taking him 108. And I'm like, you know what? Well, like, I get it. If you don't think Drake May and like basically start 10 team leagues of Drake May or Michael Penix or Bo Nix or any one of these guys is really going to ever give you basically being above the threshold of like an impactful quarterback, then yeah, go get the running back. And I think a lot of times we get so stuck in rankings, in overall rankings, we don't focus on individual leagues. So you guys know your leagues better than anyone else and how the leagues are shaped and the settings for it. So you should be able to orchestrate your rosters the best way with that, by knowing your rosters. Obviously, when you ask generalized questions for us as analysts, we're going to give you generalized answers. Now, if you give us the roster construction, the teams, the starting spots for each position, I can give you a much better answer. So I will say, for future advice, if anybody asks me a question about that, let me know your league settings, the scoring, the roster. I could be like, all right, cool. This guy's actually, it's a better bet to make for him, because there's a chance he jumps into that threshold of running backs, or that threshold of wide receivers, that threshold of quarterbacks, right? This is all like, and I get quarterbacks are the king, but and a lot of times in start 10 leagues, like, they're not really the king, because everyone has quarterbacks that are really, really good. That's 10 teams with 2 guys minimum, right? That's 20 quarterbacks off the rip. That's a lot of good quarterbacks. Some teams will likely have more than that. So that's the thing, right? So if you're talking about, oh yeah, I got Drake May at the 108, it's like, all right, is he ever going to be a guy that's difference making for you? Particularly if you have like a Lamar and you have another guy who's going to make difference making production for you. Like, if you have Dak on that roster, right? How the hell is Drake May ever going to do that? Now, I was in that position with a team where I took Drake May, but also I had a little bit older quarterbacks from the starting to age out. So like, that one made sense. But overall, like, do you see what I'm saying with this? This is what we need to focus on in Dynasty, because this is how you as a Dynasty manager consistently make plus bets to give you the best optimal roster that gives you the best chance to win, not only this year, but in the future, because that's what we want to be in Dynasty. We want to be not only contending this year, but we want to be contending in 2025, 2026, 2027. So this was a long-winded way of me saying, I hope this helped you understand roster construction as like an overall arching concept and also in a micro concept where it's talking about your individual leagues. And when you know the roster settings, you know the structure, and particularly, you know how the market values players, particularly. Maybe they're really big on running backs. You can shift it a little bit. So it's all about taking the micro, taking the macro, putting them together, and giving yourself the best chance to win year in and year out in Dynasty. So that's going to be it for our episode 1 on the fantasy football universe, the fantasy lowdown. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The do know ball question. I hope you do know ball. If you don't, come find myself, come find Jeremy Schulman, come find Aaron St. Dennis, or come find SC Romero. Any one of all 4 of us are happy to help you talk ball whenever you guys want. You want to come on TikTok, come on Twitter, come on Instagram, come on YouTube. We're all going to be here throughout the summer, into the season, and hopefully making good content that you guys enjoy. So feel free, give us a like, give us a follow, share. We would appreciate all of that. So we thank you for everything you all do to support us, because this has been a fun few weeks or a few months, but it's been a whirlwind, and we've been enjoying every second of it. So we look forward to making more content like this. And yeah, with that, I hope to see you all next week, this time next year. So see you, folks.